Hi, this is Bill Arnold. Missed a show or need me talking to help you sleep tonight? I have several solutions to that situation. Here are the podcasts from the show. You are the best for listening and supporting Faith Radio. And a warm welcome to Afternoons with me. I'm Bill Arnold. We've got Dr. Cal Beisner joining me this hour. I'm looking forward to hearing from him. I was reading an article online, and it was written by none other than Cal Beisner. I thought, I'm going to call him and hear it right from the horse's mouth. He is the founder and national spokesman for the Cornwall Alliance. You can go to cornwallalliance.org to learn more about Cal and his amazing think tank of thinkers. Cal, welcome.
Well, gee, thanks, Bill, but what kind of horse am I?
Well, you're the one that's you're the one that's going to talk in the next 20 minutes. That's the one.
Oh, so, I mean, this is like Mr. Ed, huh?
Exactly. I love Mr. Ed. That was a great show.
It was, yeah.
Who doesn't love a talking horse?
Thanks very much for having me back on the show, Bill. I really appreciate it.
Well, you wrote an article with VJ about climate scientists admit exaggerated warming, and that caught my attention.
Yeah, this is a kind of a rare thing, but there is a group of scientists who have studied, who have recently published something that acknowledges that the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is relying on models that exaggerate global warming. And what's amazing about this is that these scientists actually are scientists involved in the IPCC. This is kind of the first time the IPCC has had people come out and admit this.
So this story is headlines in the news? No?
No, the story is largely ignored by most of the media.
And why
is
that?
Typical for this. Well, part of it is just the old journalists saying that bad news is good news and good news is no news.
Right.
That's because, human psychology being what it is, people get excited about reading stories about crisis, about existential threats and tragedies and whatnot.
Sure.
And they're not really all that interested in positive, good news. And, of course, eyeballs are what advertisers pay for, and advertisers pay the bills for the journalists, So, hey, you don't see many good news articles. But another part of it is, frankly, that so much of the journalistic community and so much of the political community, and unfortunately even so much of the scientific community, are committed to the notion of catastrophic man-made global warming to the point where they're simply not willing to allow balancing information to see the light of day. Clear back in the 1980s, the Society of Environmental Journalists actually adopted a resolution saying that they should no longer try to do objective reporting about environmental issues. They should be advocates. Well, as a former newspaper reporter and editor and the son of a lifelong journalist, I can tell you that is death knell to true journalistic writing. You have to do your very best to be objective, and that's not what these folks are doing. But the cool thing on this is that we now have it from people on the inside that the models on which the IPCC relies are causing, or rather they're simulating too much warming. So this is discussed in an article in Science magazine by Paul Vucin that came out back on July 27. And part of what that says is that as climate scientists face this alarming reality, the climate models that help them project the future have grown a little too alarmist. Many of the world's leading models are now projecting warming rates that most scientists, including the model makers themselves, believe are implausibly fast. Now, these new admissions, frankly, reaffirm findings from clear back in 2014 and 2019 that most models exaggerate warming, though the evidence is that they exaggerate not just a little bit, but a lot. Frankly, the fifth generation of these computer models, the ones that underlay the 2013 fifth assessment report from the IPCC, on average, they modeled about 2 to 4 times as much warming as actually observed. Now the sixth generation, you would think that they might be improved by now, but the sixth generation, which underlie this latest assessment report from the IPCC, they overstate warming even worse, anywhere from about 2 to 5 times the actual observed warming, which indicates that the roughly $40 billion a year that governments pay to computer modelers for climate models isn't buying them much.
That's very interesting, Cal. Some of the scientists and what they have found, acknowledging that these models have errors, is that going to be a step for climate science to sort of let the pendulum swing back into the middle a little bit more? Or is that going to return to a little bit of normalcy? Or what do you think?
One would hope so.
Yeah.
Historically, science has been fairly self-correcting, partly because skepticism is of the very essence of science. A great philosopher of science, Robert Merton, back in the 1930s, wrote about that fact, that in many other endeavors, skepticism is sort of a weakness or something considered sinful. But Merton said that the institution of science makes skepticism a virtue. And so, science can be self-correcting until it becomes highly politicized, and then the self-correcting process becomes a whole lot slower. But I think we may be beginning to see that happening now with climate science.
Interesting, Cal. Are some of these scientists more willing to test some of the climate doomsday narratives now?
Yeah, I think some of them are. The statement by, excuse me, I'm looking for it here in my article. Gavin Schmidt has been, he is the director of the Goddard Institute for Space Studies at NASA. He says, quote, "It's become clear over the last year or so that we can't avoid this, and that is the fact that the models run hot." That's a good admission, particularly by Schmidt, because Schmidt has, for the past, roughly 20 years, been one of the most adamant critics of anybody who says that the models run hot. So, this is kind of like a major conversion going on here.
Interesting. There's one narrative that I think most people hear, and that is mild hysteria. So as Christians, yeah, well, I'm trying to be gentle here. Is it more than mild? It's extreme. Is it extreme, or where does it lie?
Well, I mean, a few years ago we had AOC telling us that we have only 12 years to solve the climate problem, or we're all dead. We've got the Swedish girl Greta Thunberg telling us all that that we are killing the planet, and many of her followers think that they won't grow up, that they won't reach adulthood, that humanity will go extinct before then. So I'd say that's not really mild.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. But as Christians, we start to see how the slight warming has been really helpful for people around the world in terms of feeding each other or feeding the world, and also the increase in temperature has been keeping some people from literally dying.
Yeah, and there are a variety of ways in which that happens. One of them is simply that as global average temperature rises, and it's risen, around about 1 to 1.5 degrees Celsius since 1850. As global average temperature rises, cold snaps become milder and less frequent and last shorter times. Well, cold snaps on average kill 20 times as many people per day as heat waves. So even if we were seeing heat waves increase as much as cold snaps are decreasing, we'd be seeing a 20-fold decrease in lives lost because of extreme temperatures. But actually, the heat waves are not increasing in frequency or intensity because most of the warming that's happening is happening toward the poles, that is, in latitudes that don't get that hot anyway, mostly in the winter, not in the hot summers, and mostly at night. So they're raising lower temperatures and not raising higher temperatures. So consequently, it's just a win-win there. But besides that, the warmer temperatures, especially because they're primarily toward the poles, wind up expanding arable land, that is, land that we can farm, because places that used to be too cold become warm enough for farming to take place, and that's already clearly been happening. And then besides that, the CO2 that we're adding to the atmosphere that is contributing some to some warming also makes all the plants grow better. And so we've got satellite imagery, for example, that shows very clearly that leaf coverage all over the world is increasing very significantly over the last 50 years or so. And that's good news for everything that eats plants and everything that eats something that does eat plants. And the poor benefit more from this than anybody else. The value of added crop production from 1960 to 2012 has been estimated to be just about $3.2 trillion solely from this added CO2 in the atmosphere. There are plenty of other causes for other added value, but the CO2 alone, about 3.2 trillion. And then if we forecast from 2012 to 2050, we can expect about another $9.8 trillion of extra crop production just because of more CO2 in the atmosphere. So that's good news.
That is good news. Cal, you know when you drink a Mr. Misty too fast and you get that brain freeze? You know that? Yeah. Well, this is what happens to me when I start reading headlines relative to climate change, because the climate scientists have admitted there's exaggerated warming. But when we come back, I want to talk about a new climate report that kind of talks the opposite. So Cal Beisner, Dr. Cal Beisner is my guest. We're going to take a little break and be right back. Welcome back. I've got Dr. Cal Beisner as my guest. He is the founder and national spokesman for the CornwallAlliance.org. Every time I go to that website, Cal, I always find very interesting articles written by very smart people.
Well, thanks. We try to make sure that's always the case.
There's a lot of brainiacs over there at the Cornwall Alliance, and I know you're one of them. But this article that I want to refer to now was actually one written by you. So you're the expert on this one, and it's this new climate report. It's got you shaking in your boots.
Yeah, right. And of course, it's about what's called the Sixth Assessment Report, just out from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And unfortunately, there is a very, very consistent phenomenon that happens every time one of these reports comes out. The press releases and the summary for policymakers that come from the IPCC exaggerate badly what's actually said in the substantive science sections of the report. Now, in this case, this first volume of the report, this is Working Group 1, the Physical Science Basis. This first volume is 3,949 pages long. I confess I have not read it in its entirety yet. It just came out a couple of weeks ago, and I probably never will read the whole thing. But in the scientific portion, there's actually a lot of good science, a whole lot of good science. But the summary for policymakers is put together not by the scientists, but by government bureaucrats from countries all over the world, and it tends to grossly exaggerate what's in the scientific portion, largely in order to promote the policies that the rulers of those countries want, such as President Biden now with the United States as a major contributor to the IPCC. But then the media tend to exaggerate even what comes from the summary for policymakers, and politicians exaggerate what comes from the media. So it's kind of like a game of telephone, where you start out with one thing and you wind up with something very, very different. So that's a major problem. But in this case, the report does a pretty good job. I think it's very responsible in how it talks about extreme weather events. The media tend to say, oh, there's a great increase in the frequency and the intensity of floods and droughts and hurricanes and tornadoes and wildfires and all sorts of other things because of man-made global warming. Well, the reality is there has been no upward trend in the frequency or intensity of any of those things during the period of so-called man-made global warming. So there's just nothing to explain there. And this report actually makes that pretty clear. But there is another problem with the report, and that is that it relies very heavily on very extreme scenarios of energy consumption going off into the future. And let me explain how this works. We talked earlier about how the computer models that the IPCC uses forecast more warmth than is even plausible, not just more than is likely, but that is even plausible. And now even people like Gavin Schmidt of NASA are saying that. Well, why does that happen? It's partly because of the structure of the models themselves. They assume that the various feedback mechanisms that respond to more CO2 in the atmosphere generally increase rather than diminishing the effect of that CO2. And there's some good reason to think that some of them, especially clouds, the most important, actually do the opposite. But the other reason is that all of these models are based on scenarios for the future use of energy that are not just not very likely, but quite implausible and indeed outright false already, proven false. These scenarios cooked up by the IPCC all assume that we will continue to use coal, and not just continue to use it at the level that we have done in the past, but use more and more and more of it per capita alongside a growing population from now to at least 2080, perhaps 2100. Well, the reality is that starting about 2014, global consumption of coal per capita peaked and began to decline, and there is no reason to think that that's going to turn around anywhere in the near future. But coal is the biggest emitter of CO2 in generating energy. So that means that the assumption behind all of these scenarios is already proven false. So Dr. Roger Pielke of the University of Colorado, a major scholar in this field, has pointed this out. And so the models start off with wrong scenarios about the future use of energy, and then they plug those scenarios into an understanding of atmospheric chemistry that already exaggerates the impact of CO2, so you get a double exaggeration. Now, that's something that really needs to be fixed, and let's hope that maybe by the next assessment report, which might come, another 5, 6, 7 years from now, they will fix that.
Yeah, because when you start to hear that, and you mentioned this in your article, that the media will say that it's sinful to use fossil fuels to heat or cool your home or cook your food or power your car, I get real nervous when I start hearing that. I mean,
absolutely
sinful to disobey God's word.
Yeah, because quite clearly, fossil fuels, along with nuclear especially, and run-of-river hydro, are the most reliable, the most dispatchable, the most scalable, the most affordable, the most abundant energy sources that we have. And it takes energy to do absolutely everything on which human beings depend for our health and our life. Growing food, transporting it, processing it, making clothing, shelter, transportation, communication, medical care, education, everything that we do depends on energy. And the sad thing is that what we're being pushed to do is to replace these affordable, abundant, reliable fossil fuels with much more expensive and, most importantly, unreliable, unscalable, and intermittent wind and solar energy sources. And unscalable means it's just not possible to bring them up to the vast amounts of energy that are necessary for a modern economy that actually keeps people out of poverty. And unreliable means, well, you can't generate energy from wind when the wind isn't blowing, or from sunlight when the sun's not shining. And they don't blow or shine all the time. They get interrupted, the sun very regularly, and wind sporadically.
Yeah.
And the result is you wind up with an inconsistent flow of energy into the grid, which destabilizes it and leads to power blackouts and the like what we saw in Texas back in February with the big cold snap there.
Cal, I just have 30 seconds left, but are you familiar with Mike Adams? He repeatedly written about the benefits of increased CO2 levels that have had on the planet, that it's essential for plant life to flourish.
Yep. Good guy. He's written some really good stuff in that. And in these last few seconds, may I just quickly mention that in August, we are offering to send free as our way of saying thanks when somebody makes a donation of no matter how small it is at cornwallalliance.org, a study by Robert Bryce called Not in Our Backyard. Rural America is fighting back against large-scale renewable energy projects. It's a great study, and it'll help people to keep from winding up with giant wind factories practically in their backyards that reduce property values and harm health.
Cal, thank you so much. Always a delight to have you on the show.
Well, thank you very much, Bill. God bless.
Dr. Cal Beisner has been my guest, director and founder of the Cornwall Alliance, cornwallalliance.org. After a break, we're going to talk to Nikki Koziar. She's written a book called Flooded, The 5 Best Decisions to Make When Life is Hard and Doubt is Rising. That's all next.
It's the afternoon show with Bill Arnold. Prime time, drive time. Let's get it started. Jump in your car. Yeah. What's for dinner? Hey. It's the afternoon show with Bill Arnold.
Welcome back to the show. We're so glad that you are with us today. We've had a small technical problem with our guest, so we may or may not have her with us today, but she's I read parts of her book, and it was the 5 best decisions to make when life is hard and doubt is rising. And she talks about how hard circumstances can sometimes stir something so destructive in your soul, and that's doubt. Have you gone through something really painful, really hard, and what it produced in your heart was doubt? And didn't that break your heart more than anything? So we're going to find out exactly what those 5 things are, because I know we've all gone through these times and these challenges where we have been left in a very devastated place. And Nikki's going to talk about this. We do have her on the line, so we're going to bring her on. She is the author and speaker with Proverbs 31 Ministry. She speaks nationally, and she hosts her own podcast. Her and her husband own a small farm just outside of Charlotte, North Carolina. So she's with us now. Nikki, welcome.
Hi, how are you? Thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah, Nikki, I love your energy. You're all bright and cheery. But when I read what you've gone through, I go, I'm so pleased to hear you bright and cheery. Because, come on, Nikki, you've been through a lot.
I know. You know what's so funny is there's actually a really bad storm happening outside right now, my window.
Oh, no.
And it's such a reflection of what the last few years has looked like for me, because it has been a really hard season, much like pretty much everyone else in America and across the world. We've had a really, really hard couple of years now, and it's feeling kind of like there's like a cloud following us, like what I'm looking out the window at right now.
But when I'm looking at your story, just in the last couple of years, you lost your mother, which was, of course, terribly painful, and then your brother you lost to suicide, and his battle with addictions, and then the pandemic breaks out, and there's all these other things that are personal, and in spite of all this, you've found hope, and this is what we're excited to talk to you about.
Yes, but I don't want to paint a picture of like I just, woke up one day and there was just all this hope all of a sudden. This has been, we're going on 3 years now since my mom died, and, a year and a half since my brother died. And so it's been a long process of God healing some of the broken places inside of me, so that today I can pass that same hope along to someone else.
Mm-hmm. So when you first realized that you were dealing with doubt, because when hardship comes into your life and something is very painful, that's one of the painful side effects is doubt. Like, oh, where was God in all this? And why is this so hard? So
yes.
Did you find yourself questioning God's goodness?
Oh, my goodness. Yes. And, I don't think this is something that when I say the church, I don't mean a building, but we as followers of Jesus, the church, his bride, I don't think we talk about this enough. And this kind of seems to be like this, unrecognizable, unspoken little sin in our lives where, doubt starts to write a story of unbelief inside of us, where we look at the world and we say things like, well, God is good for everyone but me. And it becomes this story, this narrative that we start to write, like God is angry at me, God is mad at me, God doesn't like me, I'm not God's favorite. And so he just keeps allowing these painful experiences to come into my life. And, what I've really found is it's the complete opposite. We as a culture have messed up that word favor because we do relate it to favorite, right? Like when we think someone has favor on us, it means that, we're their favorite. But to have favor from God, we all have the same access to God's favor, and it's his protection, it's his security, it's his mercy, it's his kindness in the midst of something that feels really, really hard. And that's what, we see through the biblical account of Noah that I write about in the book. That's what it meant for Noah to have found favor with God. It wasn't like this ding, 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 he won the lottery. It was this deep presence that God had with him in the midst of his hardships.
Well, Nikki Koziar is my guest, and she's written a book called Flooded, The 5 Best Decisions to Make When Life is Hard and Doubt is Rising. So obviously, Nikki, you used in your book, Flooded, it talks about the life of Noah and how it really helped you rebuild your faith in God. What drew you to Noah and his situation?
Well, one of the things that I do as a Bible teacher, we're not supposed to use the scriptures to make ourselves feel better, okay? But one of the things that I tend to look at it and I say, okay, God, you've given us all this wisdom, all of these people, all these heroes of our faith who have gone before us. What can they teach us about where we're at in our lives today? Because sometimes we're looking for pastors and counselors and Bible teachers like to give us this 5-step formula, right, for
Right.
how to overcome the world. But everything that we would ever go through as humans, there's someone in the scriptures who's already gone through it. And so when it comes to impossible, hard, and doubtful situations, who else was given, I mean, other than Jesus, I mean, in, the Old Testament, who else was given an assignment that the entire world looked at him and said, I'm sorry, what? You lost your mind. You're crazy. This is ridiculous that you're building this massive ark and you're bringing all of these animals in. And so I think Noah is such a strong, wise person for us to follow after when we feel like we're becoming full of doubt.
No, I love that. Now, Nikki, you described 5 decisions that Noah made. And the minute I saw that, I got very intrigued. And these are decisions that Noah made that helped you deflect some of the doubt that you were having in your own life.
Yes.
So what were the decisions that Noah made? I can hardly wait. I'll hang up and listen.
Yeah, so this all comes from the scriptures. I didn't just pull these out and just make them up. But so decision number 1 is to walk with God. And so we see that Noah was a man who walked with God. But, you and I know that God doesn't force us into anything. He invites us in, but it's our decision whether or not we're going to walk with him. And then we see decision number 2, to listen to God, right? Like God is speaking all day long, but are we listening? We're hearing, but are we actually listening? There's a big difference. And Noah listened because again and again we see in his passage or in his biblical account, God commanded, Noah obeyed. God commanded, Noah obeyed. Then we see decision number 3, to rise above doubt. That was the place where he made the decision to come into the ark despite what any was saying, any of his circumstances looked like. And it was a hard decision, I'm sure, to do that, but he decided to do that. And then decision number 4 is to remember who is in charge. And consistently we see through the biblical account of Noah that he didn't question God. It doesn't mean he didn't have questions for God, like, God, well, how is this going to work with bringing all of these animals in? But it means he never actually questioned who God was. And then we see decision number 5, to find the familiar faithfulness of God. And we see this at the end of the story when Noah comes out of the ark. The very first thing that he does is he begins to build an altar and he begins to worship and praise God. And we don't see God commanding him to do that, but we know that Noah knew that he had to get off that ark in a world that looked so unfamiliar, so hard, so impossible, to do the one thing his soul knew how to do, and that was to go back to that sacred place of worship and sacrifice before the Lord, because that's where he felt God's presence.
That's fantastic. Nikki, can I pick one of these decisions that Noah made and have you talk about it some more?
Yes, that's awesome.
I would love for you to talk about when God commanded and Noah listened. Tell us why that is so important, because it seems like today Christians are increasingly more uncomfortable with silence and listening.
Okay, so I'm going to be honest. I am too.
Okay.
I hate silence. Like we live on a farm, and so there's lots of noise all the time. And I love listening to podcasts and worship music, but one of the things that I don't think we do enough of in our culture today is to remember some of the spiritual disciplines that are in the scriptures. Now, I hate that word discipline, and a lot of people do, because it reminds us of like going to the principal's office, we're in trouble, okay?
Yeah.
Not that kind of discipline.
Or you got to do burpees or something.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So we can think the word habit, right? Like things that we saw people in the scriptures do, including Jesus, that can strengthen our relationship with God. And silence and solitude is one of the spiritual disciplines, okay? And so kind of one of my themes in my life is if it seems like God is quiet, I need to get quiet, because God's never the one who stops speaking to me. I'm the one who starts to fill my life with so much noise, I can't hear him. And so I do challenge the readers in the book, to try to sit still for 10 minutes, set that timer on your phone, and don't pray, Don't talk, don't write, don't read, don't do anything. Just sit in silence and see what happens between you and the Lord.
Oh, that's fantastic. I love it. Nikki Koziar is my guest, and she's written a book called Flooded, The 5 Best Decisions to Make When Life is Hard and Doubt is Rising. And guess what? She's made 3 copies of her book available for listeners. So if you want to get in and be part of that drawing, all you do is text the word book to 877-933-2484. Again, text the word book to 877-933-2484. We've got 3 copies of Nikki's book, Flooded, that we can give away. So all you got to do is send a text, and then we will take a short break and be right back with Nikki Koziar in just a minute. I'm back with Nikki Koziar. I always want to freeze a little bit, Nikki, when I see your last name because it has a Z on the end of it. That's silent.
Yes.
And I do want to add the Z in there because you've got 2 Z's in your last name.
Well, actually, no, it is. It's Koziar's.
Oh, it is? Okay.
Yes, I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. Rosie said it's the second Z is silent. So we just miscommunicated a little bit.
Sorry about that.
No,
Nikki Koziar's. But you know what? People say it however they want to say it, so you're good.
Okay.
I'll take full blame, Nikki. Nikki, I'll take full blame. I was listening to some of your previous YouTube interviews, and I could have sworn it was Koziar. So that is not on Bill.
No worries.
Well, I've been mispronouncing your name this whole interview, and you've been so pleasant to me, so thank you so much.
No problem.
Yeah. All right, I want to go back to something from your book, Flooded, The 5 Best Decisions to Make When Life is Hard and Doubt is Rising. When Noah was choosing to rise above his doubt. Okay, Nikki, let's just talk turkey here. Sometimes our internal doubts are just increased by other people saying, well, you really can't do that, or this is stuff that Noah certainly experienced. I mean, what was it, 125 years he spent building the ark with people coming by mocking him every day? What are you doing? What a waste of time.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Noah definitely had naysayers in his life. And, I think each of us, if we stopped for a minute, we could think of someone who has been a naysayer in our life. But there's also a hard flip to that. We've probably been a naysayer to somebody else, too, at some point in the process because we're human, right? And so doubt is just a story that is constantly being written through everyone in every situation, hard, crazy out there that we're going through. So, the scriptures don't tell us a lot about what was happening in Noah's community. But listen, I have been married for 21 years, and I know Noah was married for a really long time. And so when my husband, Chris, comes home with an idea that is a little bit kind of, I'm not too sure about that, honey. I can think it would be safe for us to assume that Noah's family was probably one of the first naysayers. I'm sorry, God said what? And you're gonna do what? And where are we gonna build this ark? And how is this gonna happen? And so he probably had to wrestle through that first initially. But we know that the scriptures tell us that Noah was a preacher of righteousness. And so for sure, Noah was, out and about telling people that this flood was coming, that, mass destruction was going to happen. Not exactly a happy message, right? But 100% people had to be like, you are insane. We've never seen a flood before. Mm-hmm. You're building an ark nowhere near water. Like, what are you thinking? And so it had to have happened. And, the sad reality is when I start to think about, when the flooding did come, and this is kind of just a sober reality of this story, like Think about the people running towards the ark, banging on the door, the children screaming. I mean, these are things we don't really think about, right, when we read this story. But they're things that definitely happen. So he definitely had to have had voices around him that were criticizing him and mocking him, and a huge naysayer for sure in his life.
You know, you think of his kids, too. They work so hard hauling all the gopher wood and the pitch, and they were at it forever, and they had to deal with probably some of their own ridicule. And, boy, your dad seems kind of nuts.
Yeah.
I mean, there were naysayers all over the place. Nikki, can you offer maybe some tips for people who are trusting God in very difficult circumstances? And they've got their own naysayers, and they're hearing this today going, I'm getting negative vibes from people.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So here's something very valuable that I have learned in my life. There's a difference between a naysayer and someone who really cares about you. And I kind of have found that the difference between the two, the naysayer, they love to show up on social media. They love to just kind of pop into your inbox, a text message. They're kind of just in and out of your life. And they love to vocalize their opinion to you. But the difference on the other side of the person who actually cares about you, like sometimes we do need people to look at us and say, okay, this is a great idea, but have you thought about this? And have you considered this? And, you know, that wisdom that comes from community and from relationships of people helping us sort through things. Because the thing is that if God gives us an assignment that feels impossible and feels hard, yes, there's going to be people saying, don't do it, you're crazy, that's wrong, it's dumb, you heard from God wrong. But then there's going to be the other people that say, okay, if God said this, then let's walk through this together and let me help you discern what God is speaking to you about in this situation right now. And so I do think that at some point Noah's wife had to become kind of that anchor in their relationship and in this assignment that felt impossible because he needed to have somebody by his side that trusted and believed in him and spoke truth into him. And so I don't know how God worked all of that out. That's one of the questions I have for him when I get to heaven. But I'm confident that there had to be someone who walked with Noah through that.
Oh, most definitely. Nikki Koziarz is my guest. Her book is Flooded, The 5 Best Decisions to Make When Life is Hard and Doubt is Rising. She's nice enough to offer 3 copies of her book to give away. So if you want to be in on that drawing, you know how that works. You text the word book to 877-933-2484. Just the word book, 4 letters. Nothing in quotations or nothing else, just the word book, 877-933-2484. We'll get you in on the drawing for Nikki's book, Flooded. You talk about finding the familiar faithfulness of God. That's such an interesting expression, Nikki. I'd love for you to say more about that.
Yes. So, you know, when we think about, let's just think about the reality of what we've walked through for the last 18 months here in the United States and across the world with COVID. Nothing really feels super familiar anymore, right? Like we kind of don't even know what to do. Do we wear masks? Do we not wear masks? Do we do this? Do we not do that? And there's so many different opinions, and it's kind of strange because as you know, I've been out teaching again in crowds, not huge crowds, but in crowds. It feels different, right? Like everyone's just kind of on edge. And think for a second what that was like for Noah to have come out of over a year of being on the ark. You know, most people, this is where it gets kind of messed up in our heads with the stories. They think it was just 40 days and 40 nights. He was on that ark for an entire year. He was the first one who God called to a stay-at-home order, like on the ark by God, okay? And so just kind of like when the country opened back up and, you know, people have been kind of like tiptoeing back out and, oh, what is this? And how do we handle this? And, you know, Noah had those same frustrations and those same fears. I mean, probably at a grander scale than anything that you and I are experiencing today. But, you know, he was on this ark for over a year. There had been mass flooding. Think about what flooding does just in our little areas, like on our farm when it floods. I mean, big, you know, ruts go into the ground and trees can get knocked over. Think about the entire earth covered in water and how different the landscape alone would have looked. And, I wondered, like, this, I don't know, this is just kind of how my brain works. Like, did he come out and he was like, okay, I know God said everyone but who's on the ark, but hello, is there anyone else out there? Like, did anyone survive? Am I the only one here? And kind of that reality sinking in, like, oh gosh, we're it. Like, none of this feels familiar right now. And so, like I said in the beginning, when Noah built that altar and he began to worship and sacrifice, that was what he knew to do to find that place of God's presence in his life. And I'll be honest with you, when I walk through something really hard, or as the country is coming out or wherever we're at in the midst of the season, like, is our first response to worship and sacrifice? No. Like, our first response is, let me figure this all out, and let me just do the next thing and just keep going. And, that's actually one of the things that people tell you when you're experiencing really bad grief, right? They say, like, just try to do things that feel normal or, feel familiar to you. And so in our souls, like, we have to find that place with God where, nothing around us feels familiar right now. It feels like we're in a very changing season in our world. And so we know, though, that seasons come and seasons go, and the faithfulness of our God, it remains the same in every single season. But are we willing to take the steps to get to that place where we can feel that familiar presence of God again?
Mm-hmm. Nikki, we've only got a couple of minutes left, but may I please ask you about your brother Mike and his struggle with mental illness and addiction?
Yes. So, my brother struggled for, over a decade with drug addiction. It came from a really bad accident that he had. He got addicted to pain medicine first, and it just kind of was this downward spiral. And unfortunately, when my mom was in the midst of she was given 6 months to live, he actually tried to commit suicide several times during that season, which made that season really, really hard. But unfortunately, after she passed away, I think he just kind of got to the point where I talk about in the book of where we get to in our souls, where we're just kind of past the point of no return. And I don't believe, hear me say this, I do not believe that mental illness ever defines our eternity. And so I know that my brother was a Christian. I know that he is with Jesus right now. But he got to that place in his spirit and his faith where he just was past that point. And so he went kind of on a downward spiral after my mom died and ended up homeless. Actually, it was very tragic. We had done everything that we could do to help him. And then he tragically made the decision to take an entire bottle of Tylenol PM, and it was the worst, one of the worst things I've ever walked through. And it still makes me sad. Like, it still hurts my heart to even talk about it. But I know that my brother is healed and whole today with Jesus.
Amen. Thank you for sharing that. I know that's not easy, but it's of great help for people who are suffering with other people who either have mental illness or addiction issues. So thank you so much for that.
Mm-hmm, absolutely.
Yeah. Nikki, it's been a delight. I'm sorry about the weather you're facing in home in North Carolina, but appreciate you rallying and coming on and doing the program. It's been great having you.
Absolutely. No problem. Thank you so much for having me on. This was great.
You bet. Nikki Koziarz has been my guest. Her book is called Flooded, The 5 Best Decisions to Make When Life is Hard and Doubt is Rising. She was nice enough to offer us 3 copies of her book. And if you want to get in on the drawing, you know that all you do is type the word book. Text it to 877-933-2484. Again, 877-933-2484, and we'll get you in the drawing for maybe you're the winner. So thank you so much for listening today and supporting Faith Radio. It's been wonderful spending time with you. I'm already excited about our time tomorrow. Dr. Greg Headington's going to continue his study on the book of John, and Dr. Alex McFarland will be joining me as well, and we're going to have a wonderful time of studying salvation as well tomorrow. That's all ahead. Have a great night, everyone. See you tomorrow. Thanks for listening. Programming like this is made available through your support. Information available at myfaithradio.com.